thanks a lot for coming to our second seminar in the series of unconscious memory. I'll just give you an outline of how we're going to proceed today, which is that we'll have two talks, one after another. If you have questions specific to the talk, there'll be time for questions after each talk, but we'll have a break after the two talks and have a drink, and with a drink in hand, begin the discussion where we will hopefully try to relate two papers to another. Our chair tonight is Ben Morgan. Yes. And so I'll hand you over to Ben's capable hands. So thanks.
Hello, thank you for coming to this seminar. I'm just turning on my phone to get my notes so I don't talk complete nonsense. So I'm very pleased to be introducing as our first speaker Michael Burke, who is a professor of rhetoric in Utrecht.
That's correct.
And has collaborated with Emily, amongst other things, editing volumes on explorations in cognitive literary science, and is a leading figure in thinking about basically has stylistics and rhetoric and how it interfaces with the expanding world of cognitive humanities. And he's going to be talking today about implicit memory in literary discourse processing.
Thank you very much, Ben. Very briefly, I'd like to thank Ben and Sohan for inviting me to this. The seminar is a great initiative. I hope to get back on the train to see a couple in the spring, if at all possible. I've been a little unwell the past couple of days, so if I feel a little dizzy, I may sit down and have a glass of water. Just give me a minute and I'll be back, don't worry. Okay. For a long while I've been interested in this particular question. What happens in the minds and bodies of readers when they read literature? As I said, I'm a professor of rhetoric, and this is at the far end of that. It's the literary rhetoric, you know, the style figures, the structure, the incoming data, and how that affects the reading process. And I'm interested in this question for a bunch of reasons. One, for example, is like the nature of literary reading-induced mental imagery. For example, it's extremely vague but extremely robust. You know, many anecdotes. It's not been scientifically proven, but there are many anecdotes of people who've gone to see their favourite novel filmed and immediately they reject. No, that's not him. That's not her. They don't live there. So something's extremely strong and robust, although it's still extremely vague as well. This question's too broad. So I narrowed it down to what happens in the brains and bodies of avid readers during engaged acts of literary reading. People who really enjoy reading literature and do a lot of it. Like you, I presume. Now, this all depends on definitions. What is an avid reader? What is an engaged act of literary reading? I'm not a social scientist, so I'm not going to approach it from that quantitative dimension. There's a lovely quote here. It's quite long, so bear with me. I'll read it aloud. And this is what I believe an avid reader is. It's by Harold Brodkey, who's a literary critic. It's from an essay he wrote called Reading the Most Dangerous Game. Okay. The act of reading, as it really occurs, is obscure. That says enough, doesn't it? The decision to read a book in a real minute, how one selects the book, how one flirts with a choice, how one dawdles on the odd path of getting it read and then reread, the oddities of rereading, the extreme oddities of the procedures of continuing with or without interruptions to read, getting ready to read a middle chapter in its turn after going off a while, then getting hold of the book physically, having it in one's hands, letting one's mind fill with thoughts in a sort of warm-up for the exercise of mind to come. One rifles through remembered scenes from this and other books. One deals with half memories and the other pleasures and usefulnesses. One wonders if one can afford to read. One considers the limitations and possibilities of this book. One is humiliated in anticipation or superior or thrilled in anticipation or nauseated in retrospect. or as one reads. One has a sense of talk and of reviews and essays, of anticipation or dread, and the will to be affected by the thing of reading, affected lightly or seriously. One settles one's body to some varying degree, and then one enters the altered temples of reading. The subjection of being played upon, one passes through phases, starting with reacting to or ignoring the cover of the book and the opening lines. This is a humanities version of what I believe an avid reader is, rather than counting how many books a person reads in a month and how engaged they are during that reading. A lot of what I talked about today was partially based on a book I wrote a while ago, Literary Reading, Cognition and Emotion, an exploration of the oceanic mind. There's just a quote here. The theory of the oceanic mind maintains that there is a dynamic, free flow of bottom-up and top-down effective cognitive inputs during engaged acts of literary reading. And further, that literary reading itself does not begin when eyes apprehend the words on the page or end when they leave off. Rather, the mind and brain are actively reading both before and after the physical act of literary text processing starts and ends. I went on to model this, and I'll show you these very briefly. I'm not going to go into it, but it'll come back at the end. I worked out that there are at least 5 what I called affective inputs. The pre-reading mood, the location of where a person chooses to read, the LRIs, the literary reading mental imagery, and then from the text itself, the themes of the novel and the characters that are embedded in that, I suppose, and the style, how it's written. Since this, I've also thought that time is also an important aspect. This is actually a very rhetorical thing. It's kairos. It's everything that goes into the rhetorical situation of a discourse act. So it's a very old concept going back to the ancient Greeks, really. I postulated that there was something called a literary reading loop, and that's what I described in the definition, that there's a physical reading phase, there's a pre-reading phase, there's a post-reading phase immediately after the reading, and there's a period when you're not reading. And I also modelled in the roles of, on the one hand, cognitive emotion, that's kind of appraisal, cognition that leads to emotion, so you appraise a feeling and then the feeling happens, and also affective cognition where the emotional reaction can happen before the cognitive appraisal, and this has been modelled by Joseph Ledoux in The Emotional Brain, when he talks about the quick and dirty route. Basically, he believes that those messages can skip a lot of high cortical processes and go straight to the emotive areas, like the amygdala. And in this, of course, is also explicit and implicit memory. And I want to talk about implicit memory because this seminar is about unconsciousness, of course, and I wanted to highlight that aspect of my work for the seminar. Now, what is the role of memory during engaged acts of literary reading by avid readers? Well, this is a very general, basic structure of memory, working memory and long-term memory. And I've highlighted there in red explicit memory, which also divides into episodic and semantic. These divisions have been around for about 30 years. You're probably familiar with them. So I want to talk about...
This line,
did you?
Seminar, yes.
Good. These are standard. So I want to talk about, very briefly, about explicit memory with regard to reading, discourse processing. Now, reading is learned, of course. We're not born as readers. Often with very mixed results. Some people never learn to read. Some people never learn to read well. It's somewhat unnatural. There's a big dispute about whether word shapes are apprehended in the visual cortex. There's an ongoing dispute between Senia Zeki, who mapped the visual cortex, and people like Stanislav Dehana, who says, you know, they do appear in the visual cortex, and Zeki says they don't. Of course, reading and writing are very recent developments, going back to Sumerian scribes. These are just, you know, it's, what is it, 6,000 years? It's nothing in brain evolutionary terms. To read, you need fixed strategies for processing and comprehension. My daughter's 4, so I'm experiencing this firsthand. And there are lots and lots and lots of discourse psychological models out there. And this is just one by a Dutch scholar, Paul van der Broeke. It's called the landscape model of reading. Like I said, there must be about 5 or 10 of these. And what they all have in common is that specific stages. Now, this landscape model of reading has 4 stages. The text, carryover from previous sentences, reinstatement from prior cycles, and background knowledge. So what you essentially have is the words, the co-text with the previous sentence, a bit more co-text, and a limited kind of context. Nothing too elaborate, maybe something at genre level, as a categorization or something like that. So it's very constrained. And it's understandable as well, of course. They're working in labs. They need controlled experiments. It's all completely understandable and rational. Now, you can find lots of quotes about the complexity of reading. Here, reading is a complex process, cognitive process, in which the reader, through interaction with the text, constructs meaning. Reading is extracting information from texts. Reading is a complex performance that requires simultaneous coordination across many tasks. So you get the picture that that reading is, as far as discourse psychologists are concerned, a very explicit memory-based thing. And of course, short-term memory plays a role, and there's interactions between short-term and long-term memory. There's a model I'll be talking about in a minute, Lawrence Barsalou's PSS model. This is something that was published quite recently, actually. It's very interesting. Stanislas Dehaene is, I don't know if he's Belgian or French. He's a French speaker, anyhow. He's got has anybody heard of him or read his work? Yeah? Yeah. He publishes a lot of articles, I know that much. They're all available on his website as well. He's got a huge team, and he's constantly doing work on reading. Now, he doesn't look at literature at all. That's number one. He says that's far too complex, we're not going there. So, is it worth me telling what? Well, it is. I'm going to tell you what he does, but he doesn't look at literature. He looks at basic words and small phrases and how those are apprehended in the visual cortex. This is the, like I say, he's trying to find word forms in the visual cortex, even though the guy who mapped the visual cortex said it's impossible. He says there are at least 12 designated areas of the brain involved in reading. And this is my favourite quote from his work, Dehaene's work. He talks about the whole problem of meaning and how it gets coded. And he says the process itself of meaning in the brain is utterly mysterious. So this is the team that's really working on this stuff, and they don't know how meaning works. So that gives us some room to theorize as humanities scholars. We can step into the into the void, I presume. Okay, now implicit memory. You think that after what I'd said that most of reading is quite explicit. Implicit is primarily a case of procedural memory and priming. I do a lot of priming, but in a completely different context. When I teach a course called Persuasion in Social Discourses, it's a rhetoric course with third-year undergraduates, and we look at how people are primed by primarily advertisers to make purchases that they wouldn't ordinarily make. Things like nudge theory and stuff like that. It's very interesting. I suppose a key work in this field, and even though it's quite old now, is Schachter's work from the late 1990s. And he maps out most of this together with his colleagues. I'm not going to read these aloud, I'm just going to summarize them a little bit. He basically says they kind of permeate almost all of our everyday lives. It's all about, can a person retrieve information from a past experience without being aware that he or she is relying on memory? And almost all of these experiments have been with amnesic patients. Very interesting stuff, but not really, a bit too clinical for us, I think. But they have some word completion tasks, which are basically more priming. Very interesting, you know, how patients can remember something even though they say, I've never seen it before. Here are some examples. So a skilled typist typing, a skilled driver driving, a skilled cleaner cleaning, brushing your teeth, tying your shoelaces, locking your front door when you leave house, reciting the alphabet, signing your name, reciting a memorised poem, and plausibly a skilled avid reader reading a work of fiction in an engaged manner. Lots of question marks there. Procedural memory. This is one of the important aspects of implicit memory, guiding the processes, automatic retrieval, procedural learning. The motor regions are involved in this as well, according to some neurobiological experiments, and habit, of course, you know, doing things over and over and over again. Ties into that procedural memory. Priming is interesting because at first they thought it was just a memory in your visual cortex, because you've got little memory systems everywhere in your brain. It's quite strange if you think about it. And a lot of this implicit memory in babies develops much earlier than explicit memory. I think explicit memory doesn't start until like 9 months, something like that. There's also a memory system in the amygdala, I think. So they originally thought through experiments that priming was only a matter of memory in the visual cortex, but it transpires that also semantic memory is involved at some level. So priming is not just perceptual but also conceptual. But here we've got to bear in mind what Dehaene also said about anything meaning semantic based and how difficult that is to pin down when we're talking about reading specifically. If this all seems familiar, I suppose somebody else did it in a slightly different way not too long ago. It always makes me think of Proust when I think about implicit memory. Okay, so back to a question. How can that most cognitive act, so reading, and in this case engaged acts of literary reading by avid readers, centrally involve implicit memory? How does that work? How might it work? Well, here are the 4 categories again. I'm still thinking about this, and I'd be interested in your input. I think pre-reading certainly has procedural memory and priming. The reading itself, if you're an experienced reader, is down to your habits and your skills. Post-reading, I'm not quite sure about that. It's a non-conscious kind of resonance after effect where you stay in the novel. Certainly if it's emoted you and it has a powerful ending. And non-reading, there's something in cognitive psychology called SET. And SET says that any preparatory cognitive activity that precedes thinking and perception. So there's stuff going on in your brain, even though it's at a subconscious level. And I should say at this stage, maybe I should have said it earlier, I'm not sure whether consciousness exists, to be honest. It's a big debate, isn't it? If it does exist, it's probably very fleeting, and yeah, we can talk about that later if you like. I want to now tell you about Barsalou's perceptual symbol system, because I've used this in other articles and it's helped me quite a bit to model how information gets held in long-term memory and interacts with the buffer regions of short-term memory, sometimes becoming conscious, mostly not. So Barcelou had this theory of perceptual symbol systems, and he mapped out these buffer regions, the kind of schematic memories of perceived events. There's this interaction between short-term and long-term memory. He actually says that during retrieval procedures, simulators can either become active unconsciously in implicit memory or consciously in explicit memory. I very much agree with this. And this is his, not very inspiring, but his little model. Now, a chair is very different from a literary word, of course. There's a huge jump there, which we can talk about. But this is how he sees it, from encoding to storage to retrieval, which he looks at as simulation. So you perceive a physical stimulus, in this case the chair. He talks about these buffer regions as feature maps. In fact, he has some different levels there. And these get stored, and these can be then activated non-consciously, and they can reach full consciousness or not. It depends. You've got no control over that. But what does come out will be something not very different, but slightly different, because it's been stored. It'll have the shape, but it won't be the same. So, I think that during engaged acts of literary reading by avid readers, many simulators probably never reach full consciousness, but remain unconscious. I really believe that, and that probably goes against almost everything that's been discussed in discourse psychology. And I think it's these kind of things that are important for the avid literary reader: implicit memory and emotional memory, and procedural, but also, and priming, but also episodic and autobiographical. You can't rule out explicit memory completely. I really do think that the two are working together, but that we really shouldn't underestimate how important implicit memory or unconsciousness is in a very cognitive act. So this is a typical model that you see all over the place. So instead of these two being highlighted in text processing, I think we can actually take all four into account. Now, finally, I think what's important is to set out a kind of cline of different reading experiences and kind of hypothesize to what extent implicit memory is involved or not, and why. Because, you have literature, you have poetry, you have all kinds of everyday texts, shopping lists and stuff like that. You could call it from proofs to prescriptions. And of course, there's lots more going on here that I haven't even touched on. For example, looking at different kinds of readers with regard to how they process texts. All different kinds of readers. I've just touched here on Women and Men. I just read a book by Belinda Jack, who's at this university, The Woman Reader, and she makes a very good case that throughout history women have read very different to how men have read. So there's a lot to be looked into. So no definitive conclusions, hopefully some food for thought, and I think I'll end there.
Also to be introducing Sebastian Gross, who's teaches at Roehampton, and is currently leading a big project on memory. He's worked on lots of aspects of post-war British literature, on the construction of London as well as the literary topos. The current work is the focus on memory. He's edited a book on memory in the 21st century called Perspectives from the Arts, Humanities and the Sciences. And the first fruits of this new project will appear soon in an article called Boosting Memory and Tom McCarthy's Remainder. And today he's going to be talking to us about neurofictions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Simon and Ben for organising this. Thank you very much for having me. Also, I'd like to thank Kirsten Shepherd-Barr, who we did this wonderful event on Proust and a Madeleine episode, which was a while ago now, but it involved smelling and tasting, and it was this wonderful way of kind of, it was a public engagement event and trying to evoke autobiographical memories with literary scholars, neuroscientists, and a philosopher, those types of things. So, so that's really wonderful. And I want to thank Michael already because you've given me a couple of ideas about reading and memory. So thank you very much, and I hope to talk to you afterwards. So, our contemporary period is characterized by a multiplicity of revolutions that together are radically reshaping the context of our thinking of what it means to be a human being. Once again, the human mind and body are sites of contestation, and there is a great concern for cognition and, more specifically, memory in the 21st century. Major power struggles are currently playing themselves out, and scientists and scholars are staking their claim. And the memory network is kind of intervening in that, and we try to kind of bring scientists, scholars, artists and writers together to think about memory in the 21st century, engage in those debates. I've got a website here, and if you go there you will find films, blogs, writings, and indeed, as Ben says, there will be a collective anthology of our writings where we have written around clusters of themes which will be coming out in the next year. So we kind of aim to map and respond to these new contexts, from globalization to the aging population, the digital context, those types of new contexts. And we try to bring the sciences and the arts, humanities and writers together. And one of these things was what has become known as the Soho experiment, with a neuroscientist called Hugo Spears, who works at UCL, the writer and psychogeographer Will Self, whom I'm sure you all know, and a literary scholar, which was me. And we investigated the role of the posterior hippocampus in navigating space in the outside world. So I'll tell a bit more about that. We were interested in seeing if neuroscience could offer new, reinvigorating perspectives on psychogeography, which is a revolutionary attitude to life, now in its 6th decade. Psychogeography involves mapping and subversion of urban planning, architecture, and non-invasive techniques such as fMRI and eye-tracking technologies could potentially make new discoveries about how urban spaces impact on the subject's psychology. As a literary scholar, I was interested in placing Self's work in cognitive literary studies and specifically neuroliterary criticism, which is kind of this growing field. Will Self made this extraordinary claim when Hugo and I discussed the project at the start. He says when he was writing a novel, sort of keeping control over 100,000 words, he said, "I can feel my hippocampus throbbing." And I'm not quite sure if he was ironical or not, but it was a very interesting thing because it kind of suggested that there's this link between walking space, walking London, for instance, and the writing of a novel. So this is maybe in the back of our mind something that we were interested in as well, the kind of correlation between psychogeographic walking and the act of writing a novel. Spears's mentor, Eleanor Maguire, she first discovered that the posterior region of the hippocampus is significantly larger in London black cab drivers compared to, let's say, bus drivers who drive a fixed route. Black cab drivers are special because, unlike their throughout the world, even if you compare them to other taxi drivers in, let's say, Holland, who use GPS systems, they have to do the knowledge, which is a 3-year training program. You have to learn the 25,000 streets of London, and they have to do this grueling test, choosing 2 different points and then naming all the streets in the correct order, those types of things. Will Self was aware of this research by Eleanor Maguire, and his book, the novel The Book of Dave, is referring to that science. It features a London black cab driver, Dave Rudman, whose depressed psychotic mind slowly unravels after his wife takes away his son Carl. The psychologically traumatized mind of Rudman becomes racist, misogynist, a religious fanatic, and the rants he writes down in a book becomes kind of a new Bible for a community of surviving Londoners after this apocalypse 500 years later. It didn't surprise us that Self was kind of interested in working with neuroscientists. Some of his characters are often described in a quite solipsistic manners. Let's see. So one of the descriptions of Rudman was Dave was sunk inside himself, and Rudman also has this serotonin depletion that gives him this kind of history of depression. The future Londoners in the Book of Dave even adopt this kind of neurological vocabulary. They say, I believe he committed it to memory, he is Dave, and it is London. As you may be aware, brain scans have confirmed that the posterior hippocampus in London cabbies can be considerably enlarged. That's where the book is buried, and that's where more to it, just his knowledge. And this is quite interesting. We also see this kind of skepticism about neurocognitivism. There is this kind of irony and absurdity in the language here. The new Londoners 500 years from now don't really understand that a book is buried in your hippocampus. It's kind of this metaphor which becomes literalized. And that's kind of a surreal way of thinking, and Self is obviously a surrealist and an absurdist. It's also interesting, perhaps, that Self uses the word buried in the sense that Self is interested in unconscious knowledge being hidden behind the surface layer of the conscious mind, and we may want to talk about how that may work. So I think Self is not really interested in the clean, rationalized space of the A to Z, which have this kind of seductive but fallacious Euclidean logic. His aim is to fearlessly bore down into the complexities of the psyches through his linguistic pyrotechnics and his idiosyncratic iconographies. As one character says in his novel Dorian, what I want to know doesn't appear in the A to Z. More recently, there have been more experiments with, or interest in, the brains of cabbies. There was this project called the Cabbie Shelter, which was involved a couple of visual artists and a writer. One of the artists was Kathy Prendergast, who created this large-scale drawing of the 320 roots that make up the knowledge, which she then superimposed onto the A to Z. I haven't got the image with the A to Z and the drawing superimposed, but this is quite interesting. The runs, these are called runs, drawn in translucent ink, show the crisscrossing, overlapping and layering of the roots and the connections between them. The work is reminiscent of an anatomical drawing of veins defined by the boundary of the 6-mile radius of London that cab drivers learn. Charing Cross is the centre of London in that respect. The image of the Ed25 of the map itself conjures up the image of a brain. The drawing refers to both the city as an organism and the synapses of the brain. And I think this is really interesting. I don't want to get into much detail now, but there is this kind of humanist tendency to take humanist organic structures to kind of humanize the metropolis, these incredibly big cities, and we may want to think about the uses of that. And where neuroscience fits in, for instance. So writers and artists are very much drawn to neuroscience, and they are interested in how neuroscience can help them think about the subjective self and how we relate to the world. Neuroscientists such as Hugo are also drawn to understanding how neuroscience can illuminate artistic processes, reading activities, and how the imagination works. And I've got a bit of a problem with that. We'll explore that later. They do want to explore how culture works in the brain, how a novel takes place in the brain, and how music, for instance, affects the mind. So Fiona Shaw, the actress, she recited The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot in an fMRI scanner. Daniel Margulies and Chris Sharp have used fMRI scanning to show how strongly and beautifully the mind responds to Igor Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, for instance. There's all these kinds of experiments involving fMRI scanning. Neuroscience has much to offer, I think, when we think about the relationship between the bodily materiality in relationship with the mind, and the new field of neuroaesthetics and neurolit crit is flourishing. We are kind of guilty of that as well. we put Will Self in the scanner, as I'll show you in a second. But the consensus, I think, in the humanities is that we should be cautious in overestimating the neuromania that is kind of currently operating in society. There are loads of neuroscientists who think that they have revolutionized life and they can know everything about how the world works and how the mind works and those types of things. We should resist the idea that all human cognition depends on neural activity alone. Cognition and memory are only partly produced by the brain, I want to argue, and there are complex workings, phenomenological kind of inputs, culture, language, gender, which all determine our relationship to the world. And to invoke Freud, we are prosthetic gods whose mind extends out into the world, connects with other people and places via our bodies and technologies. These external factors, which I think are very important, the power of those external forces kick-started psychogeography in the mid-1950s in Paris. The Situationist International, led by Guy Debord, came up with this artistic, militant movement which had quite radical, subversive underpinnings. They had their, they came from Dadaism and Surrealism, and they reacted against the modern cosmopolis, which they thought as a space of alienation. This is kind of what Guy Debord defines psychogeography as. It could set for itself the study of precise laws and specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organized or not, on the emotions, behavior of individuals. This makes it sound very scientific, but it isn't. It's kind of mocking science partly, and it takes up a number of strategies which are ludic, playful, in order to kind of get away from the rational strategies that are part of planning and architecture. The dérive, for instance, the drift, unconscious drift through the city, and détournement, the rerouting and the hijacking of normal hierarchical kind of cultural structures which they turn against itself. And self is, I don't know, kind of an extension of these kinds of ideas of kind of subverting and being politically recalcitrant. So this is quite interesting, I thought, that self went into the scanner with us. He had to do this kind of route walking Soho, memorizing specific bits, cafes, corner shops, all sorts of things. And the next day he was scanned, and Hugo used fMRI images in order to kind of see how his hippocampus responded to the questions he was asked. He had to do particular routes and kind of reconstruct those routes. Afterwards, there is this is Self's brain, already a representation of his brain. I'll come back to that later. To kind of talk himself through his decision-making processes during that experiment. And Hugo's team had two different hypotheses. He thought that Self's hippocampus would be extremely active because He's a psychogeographer, he thinks about space, so he's very much conscious of how to make spatial decisions. He would also be much more engaged in the debrief after the scanning, which would also confirm that kind of hypothesis. And he was right. This is the kind of graph that we end up with, and this is Self's kind of performance. And so he's not off the map, but he's done extremely well, as you can see. So this is interesting. He's an extremely, engaged plotter. He's thinking about space all the time. So that's very interesting, I think. So the problem is, of course, there's only one test subject. He was part of 24 other case studies, but this doesn't say anything about writing. So the upshot of this is that it's quite limited in terms of what we've proven. One man's brain doesn't constitute any kind of solid scientific evidence. And he wrote this piece for Esquire as well, chronicling the whole project and experiment. He also noted the limitedness of the feelings. So I want to discuss, before I discuss the value of the SOAHO experiment and looking at maybe some future research, I'd like to identify also some instructive failures of the experiment. And this involves maybe a kind of a glitch between, on the one hand, neuroscience and the way in which humanities think about space. Most neuroscience who do this kind of scanning, these kinds of experiments, they start with John O'Keefe and Lynn Nadel's The Hippocampus as a Cognitive Map from 1978. This is quite interesting because O'Keefe and Nadel are interested in psychological space rather than physical space. But the interesting thing is that they reject the modern notion that any investigation into absolute space should entail a relative or relational theories of space. So for O'Keefe and Nadel, the concept of absolute space is primary, and its elaboration does not depend on prior notions of relative space. And this is kind of what they formulate in the introduction about the idea that they basically keep this kind of Euclidean space, and relative space doesn't really exist for them. So they do agree that we move throughout space, we're in this room, we've got subjective perceptions, but the room itself is the room, this is it. And that is quite interesting, because for literary scholars and writers and psychogeographers, they have problems with the rejection, I think, of privileging absolute space. One of the major modernist revolutions was the incorporation of non-Euclidean geometries and the theory of relativity. And I think the most famous example is James Joyce's parallax, which replaced subjects and objects into a relational subjective paradigm. This is also related to the psychogeographers. Henri Lefebvre was this great theorist of space, noted that we cannot simply analyze objects in space, but we must also focus on space itself. Space is not a passive receptacle. So space is never innocent, it's not a given, but it's produced by laws and powers which inscribe their powers into the behavior of the individual human being. So I think that is very important. And I think that maybe neuroscientists can maybe learn from that experience as well and incorporate that into their working day practice, in their practice as scientists. And I think the title, Hippocampus as a Cognitive Map, is kind of this weird affirmation of the point that Self made earlier. that people often tend to think of the metaphor that I've got a map in my brain. They kind of think that that is real in a sense, and we don't have a cognitive cognitive map in our hippocampus. It's an organ that does that, and so it's interesting. The first two lines in that book are interesting as well. They say scientific theories have been likened to maps. Like maps, they provide a means for finding one's way in an unknown domain. So again, there's this constant taking literal metaphors. So I think this is very important, and in many ways the practice of fMRIing does the same thing. This is something that Boris Katchka has warned us about. fMRI can take pictures of the brain at work, tracking oxygen flows to selected chunks while a patient performs assigned tasks. This is what we did with self, of course. Most active sections are just lit up, very beautiful, sometimes in dazzling colors, referring to seeming to show clumps of neurons in mid-thought. Lehrer, this is Jonah Lehrer, which we won't get into, warned of the machine's deceptive allure. The important thing, he concluded, is not to confuse the map of the place for the map of the place itself. Thank you very much. So maps are representational, and I think there is this glitch sometimes which happens in a neuroscientific practice. There's on other levels as well. The neuroscientists don't really include thinking about language, about linguist kind of structures. And when you were scanning, just to give an example, one of the 24 cabbies, they all said, or one of them said, yeah, I was scanning my brain, and clearly the test subjects were taking over the neurological kind of language, but there was no kind of mechanism to kind of think through the implications of that. So this is important, and this is where I think the humanities can have a role to play. A couple of other points to make is that the dominance of the visual, I think, is also quite detrimental for neuroscience. We have all sorts of other senses that are active as well, and I think the dominance of the visual, particularly in fMRI, blinds us to the fMRI methodologies itself. Edward Hutchins has done research into the fMRI practice itself. He's been looking at how scientists use gesture, language, and material structures present in a socially and culturally constituted environment. And they call the fMRI practice action as cognition. So the point is that even neuroscientists, they do not just think with their brains, but they also use their bodies, gesture. So the body is very much involved in thinking in the lab as well. So there's a couple of things that Hugo and I have been talking about and see how we can learn from one another, and that's kind of an ongoing discussion. But there is something interesting as well that we kind of discovered, and in a way Will Self discovered this for us. He wrote this article for Esquire, as I said, and he had this idea when he was watching his brain being kind of being analyzed by Lorelei, who was the neurologist in charge. He said, watching Lorelei move the cursor across the screen of a laptop, bringing different bits into my brain, of my brain into view, it occurred to me that it wasn't accidental that many of the first narrative fictions took the form of journeys, picaresques, in which the heroes have odd encounters along the way. For perhaps the very structure and functioning of the human brain is implicit in such schemas. And this is a very interesting idea, I think, and this chimes in with O'Keefe and Adele's book in the first place. They note that the hippocampus is not just the organ that maps place and space, but it's also the organ that organizes the deep structure of language. So there is maybe this overlap between space and language processing. They say sentences about the location of objects or the occurrence of events in physical space have an obvious and natural representation within a spatial map structure. This is very interesting, I think. So this may enable us to think about how we can use the hippocampus in different ways and place cells. I don't think I've got too much time to get into that. The idea of place cells, which are made in every space that you enter, it's being placed in the hippocampus. I'm wondering how those place cells can be used during the reading experience. So when I say London or Trafalgar Square or Amsterdam, it immediately kind of conjures up an image as well. And I'm wondering how that there's potentially an overlap. So there's an interesting way of bringing reading into thinking about space as well. So to conclude, the SOHO experiment had mixed results. Writers will continue to draw experience from the amazing developments taking place in neuroscience, and we will continue to let it inform our thinking about identity, selfhood, psychology. It hasn't kind of affirmed for me that it's better maybe to think about how the brain is represented in literature rather than thinking about how literature responds in the brain at this stage. I think that is very important. I also hope that neuroscience will incorporate and talk to humanities scholars a bit more and incorporate some of our practices into their discipline. Mental mapping, I think, is a trope that does unite our disciplines, so that's important. And we could, I think, together explore going beyond the binary of simply investigating the brain in culture and culture in the brain. If we unite these by exploring the interchange between the real experimental experience spaces that we remember, which are vital for our construction of imaginary worlds through reading, but also vice versa. And I guess I'm not sure about the thing that Sohn was kind of calling out, the complete discrepancy, discreteness of the imagined world and our kind of real experiences. That's it. Thank you.